The struggle for the Batavian Empire. Discuss the struggle between the VOC and other European countries to control the Indonesian islands and the riches they offered. The scent was earthy, sweet, and seductive. It was the start. It is nutmeg. Cloves are employed. A mace. The spices of kings and the money of empires. These were not so much seasonings as the spices of monarchs. Besides, those spices grew in the wild, secluded from Europe's grasp, somewhere in the dense jungles and volcanic heights of the East Indies, until the sails came into view. In the early 1500s, when the Portuguese arrived on the Moluccas for the first time, the world was forever altered. In seeking something so unimportant, no European had ever ventured so far. Nutmeg, though, was said to cure the disease and bring immortality. Its worth was more important than gold. Honestly with you, it would only be violence. Forts were soon built by the Portuguese, who were able to negotiate with the local sultans in Ternate and Tidore as they balanced diplomacy with guns. They feigned God, but were merely merchants in armor. They were adventurers who were motivated by wealth. However, even before they were able to consolidate their control, they started to lose their hold on things. Other nations in Europe looked with a sense of jealousy. For the purpose of consolidating its control over the Philippines, Spain advanced from the northward direction into the region. Among its most treasured acquisitions would be Java, and the port city of Jakarta would be the jewel in the crown of that prized acquisition. Directed by Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, attacked Jakarta in 1619 and burned the city to the ground, establishing their own capital, Batavia. The fortress would be the arena of their imperial longing, including the dispatch of ships, the collection of taxes, and the conduct of war. But commerce would not be enough. The VOC was not after market share. Its true desire was to monopolize. In the Banda Islands, where volcanic earth had produced a dense forest of nutmeg, the indigenous people resisted efforts by volatile organic compounds, VOC, to monopolize production. What followed was one of the first examples of genocide driven by corporations. When Cohen returned, he did so with mercenaries, soldiers, and an inhumane plan. In 1621, the native Bandanese people were mass murdered, males murdered, females enslaved, and children sold into slavery. In a short period, over 90% of the population had been exterminated. Survivors were forced to flee, were tracked down, or sold into slavery. The islands were subsequently resettled with imported slaves and dedicated Dutch settlers who were forced to grow nutmeg under strict VOC control. A company that plundered, colonized, and ruled with not a shred of fear of consequences. Never before had the world experienced such a force. The profits amassed by the VOC were nothing short of phenomenal. But behind every shipment of cloves was the skeletons of those who had the temerity to resist. Nevertheless, the Dutch were not the only ones who had goals. With their very own imperial organization, the British East India Company, the British rushed into Southeast Asia when they became aware of the opportunities that were available. Rivalry was a fierce competition. As they progressively nibbled at the margins of territory controlled by the VOC, the British erected flags in the islands of Sumatra and Malacca. By the 18th century, tensions on a global scale had reached a crescendo that culminated to open combat. The collapse of the Dutch Republic and the exposure of its colonies occurred concurrently with France's descent into anarchy in Europe under the leadership of Napoleon. The VOC, which was corrupt and bloated, was no exception to the rule that empires fell not because they were conquered, but because they were greedy and neglected. In 1811, a grand invasion of Java was launched under the ambitious and reformist leadership of Stamford Raffles in the interests of the British. The Dutch were completely overwhelmed. Raffles, in impressive decisiveness, asserted British rule over the very heart of the Batavian Empire, and in 5 years went on to transform the empire itself. He was able to ban the slave trade in some areas, encourage free trade, and actively encouraged education. Furthermore, he was fascinated by the cultural treasures of Java, ranging from its ancient monuments. Because of the huge size of its debts and the scandals which followed, the Dutch government was forced to intervene. Once the ships have sunk and the flags have been lowered, what remains of an empire built upon the spice trade and blood? To be honest with you, there is still much to be revealed. It was the Dutch who left behind a model of government, one that included divisions, plantations, roads and railways, as well as elaborate bureaucracies. In the space of a single colonial structure that would eventually become Indonesia, they established new frontiers, displaced settled kingdoms, and forced peoples of different kinds to live under one system. The economy they established for the plantations persisted through changing ownership, still taking advantage of both labor and land, was invented during colonial times, when intellectuals and nationalists were trying to imagine a future free from imperial domination. While the ports, towns, and cities that used to be crowded with VOC fleets have grown to accommodate international trade, the specters of conquest linger in the languages, the surnames, and the architecture of old colonial structures. When you breathe in the scent of nutmeg, pepper, or cinnamon, you get to breathe in the memories of the empire. Even today, the spices that changed the world shed oceans of blood and birthed the very first global corporation in the world still speak their story. Though it was a war for land, the struggle for the Batavian Empire was more. It was a war of greed and defiance, a war of business fought under the cover of cannonballs. It was a tragedy written in fire and silver, the consequences of which extended far beyond the borders of Java or the Banda Sea. It was a tragedy written in ships and chains. The ghosts of men killed for spice continue to haunt the forests of Maluku, the winding streets of Jakarta, and the great oceans where VOC ships once patrolled. And if history can teach us anything, it is that if profit is the only benchmark an empire has, the road may end in wealth, but it is rarely just. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.